Okay, so we've been discussing the mitzvah of the status of gerushin, of Jewish divorce, and focusing on whether there's a mitzvah or not. We're in the middle of discussing the view of the Rambam. So just to make it, just to go back for a minute or so, there is a debate both about gerushin and kiddushin, about divorce and marriage, whether these are simply institutions, and it's not really doing them justice to say the word simply either, meaning are they institutions but not mitzvos, imperatives, obligations? Do they belong in the count of 613 commandments or not? So there's a debate on this point. There's a range of views with regard to marriage and with regard to divorce. However,
can I ask you, Havamina, what would be, if it in case were an institution but not a mitzvah, what would be the parallel in halacha that we have such an extensive institution without mitzvahs attached to them?
Well, the truth is, a lot of what we call mitzvos look like institutions. For example, you look in Parshas Mishpatim, the Shomrim, the four Shomrim. For example, Shomer Chinon, Shomer Sachar, Shoel, Socher. They're according to most perspective, they're laws, they're categories, they're classification, right? But they're not. There's no obligation to be a show, to watch or guard or take responsibility for someone else's deposited, object. But there are rules about them. In that sense, they're institutions, right? There is an obligation to appoint a court, shoftim v'shotrim, titan l'chol b'chol sha'arecha. So, that is, a positive commandment according to many, although there's some Gaonim who think that there's just something called an institution of the court. So there are actually many things that are counted in the 613, that really more qualify. For example, the earlier authorities in the Gaonic time, post-Talmud, but pre-medieval, the Bahag, Reb Sajagon, they typically didn't divide mitzvos between positive and negative commandments like Rambam did, and everybody pretty much after the Rambam. What they did was they had positive and negative, and they had parshios. Parshios means is the equivalent of talking about institutions. And then they had some institutions that fall upon the tzibur, the community, and other institutions, which also can be partaken, by individuals. So actually, there are, there's quite a long list of institutions. Now with the Rambam, maybe, would be more hesitant to count, institutions than others, but, usually looks for a way to, in my view at least, where the methodology, which is what we've been talking about, kind of highlights that that the approach, is spiritually consequential, we'll say, but even he, in some cases, what some people call a matir, a mechanism that allows for certain participation or consequences, etc., are also in many cases institutions. So it's a good question, but there definitely is ample precedent.
And do you think historically, or I could only guess, that the Rambam was transitioning from, as you just said, the post-Talmud Gaonim, who were all listing mitzvahs and counting them, to like almost that he did it because they did it, but that really wasn't where he was headed, and he went beyond that, because it's not something that seems to be historically carried on. Like, we don't have every generation of Achronim or saying, well, here's my list, or this is that list. There seems to be
Right.
less.
I mean,
That doesn't mean that
again,
they don't
Baal
believe that
Halachos
they're good.
Gedolos, some of the Gaonim did, they counted them. In my opinion, two things. Number one, it was very natural for somebody like the Rambam to count.
Right.
I don't think he was continuing. I think it's part of, and I think the way that he counted, and this is, not something I can elaborate on right now, but except for the examples that we're actually looking at, but the way that he counted was consistent with his reorganizing all of Jewish law in the Ad Chazaka into 14 books, and consistent with his conceptual orientation. In other words, not just presenting the facts, in an efficient way or even in a pragmatic, way for a code of law so you'd know what to do, that also, but more importantly, the reorganization and the classification, and I think also the counting of mitzvos and the rules of counting the mitzvos are all about presenting as comprehensively and accurately as possible, like the total system, right, conceptually, of Jewish law. So actually, there was precedent to count the mitzvos, and I think the Rambam came from that I agree with. He came from that orientation, but rather than just kind of continue it, I think he embraced it even more, and he transformed it in two ways. Number one, he was much more conceptually driven. As far as I know, he's the first to ever propose rules, meaning when the Rambam formulates his 613 commandments and he lists them, I think two things are unique. Number one, he divided all of them between positive and negative commandments, Essen and Laban. And secondly, he provided rules, the Sharashim, as they're called, meaning he outlined, what his thinking was in terms of, what he was going to count and what he wasn't going to count. And as far as I know, he's the first person to do that comprehensively. Everybody else, we kind of have to guess or speculate, I guess, a better word, to try to reconstruct what were they thinking when they included this and they omitted that. Now, in the Rambam, there's still plenty to speculate about, but at least we're speculating from a position of knowledge and strength, because he gave us whatever it is, 13, rules.
Right.
And they're not short rules. They're some of them are each one is a kind of an essay, some more extensive, some less extensive. Ad Kedei Kach that, Ramban, comments on them, on the details, the examples, and also on the principles. So I think he jumped in with both, embraced the opportunity, and his perspective, excuse me, his perspective is really consistent, with what he does in the reorganization and the classification, and so on. So I don't think he was reluctant. He, that's why I think it's very important to actually pay a lot of attention to everything that he did in Sefer Mitzvos. In some respects, he himself writes, it's a kind of a blueprint for, this magnificent total presentation of all Jewish law, the Ad Chazaka, in 14 massive volumes. So, and remember that he begins that presentation, that extensive one, with the minyan, what's called the Minyan HaMitzvos HaKatzar, which is the short form, just a page and a half in the beginning of Mishnah Torah, where he lists all 613 mitzvos. And by and large, they're consistent, by and large, with Sefer Mitzvos. And then again, he did it. So this is the third attempt. The Sefer Mitzvos, the Minyan HaKatzar. Then there's the Koteret, what we call the crown, but kind of the preamble of every section in the Rambam. So that's not reluctance, that's enthusiasm. And as I say, I think very consistent, with his orientation and something that I also think now in response to what your comment about, we don't see this all the time. I think that's true. I mean, we did see it, in the medieval period, the Smag and the Smak, and after the Rambam, of course, the Sefer Chinuch and a few others. But I think one of the reasons we don't see so much of it anymore is because the Rambam did such a like everything else, his presentation was so dominant, that we see commentaries on his presentation instead of,
Right.
other independent, efforts. I wouldn't say we don't have any, but, we don't have so many, and basically rendered, everything else practically, moot. So even though, again, the Ramban is, presenting a Sefer Mitzvos, but he's presenting it through, his critique, of the Rambam. And the Smag, the Sefer Mitzvos Gadol, Rabbi Mikutzi, one of the Bali Tosas, his, he has a Tosafist Sefer Mitzvos on the one hand, but everything he does, including Sefer Mitzvos, everything he does is tremendously influenced by the Rambam. He's like, a French, combination of French, Balitosis and a Rambam influence. So I think it's just a testament to the Rambam's, pervasive influence. Just like Jewish law was never the same after the Rambam. Doesn't mean everybody agreed with him, but nobody could ignore what he wrote. And, there's so much in commentary, super commentary, just response to everything that he did. So, yeah, I think that's why we do spend so much time on it, and not, excuse me, I'm sorry, we're not making more of it. We're just appreciating, what he clearly considered to be a very, critical aspect of his presentation. Okay. Anyways, so getting back to the Rambam, so there are when it comes to the question of Gittin and Kiddushin, whether they're mitzvahs or not, one view is that they're institutions. The other view is that they're, requirements, imperatives to go out and to do these things. Now, when we say go out and get married, that we can understand. Go out and get divorced, obviously, that doesn't make any sense. Obviously, divorce is an unhappy circumstance. It's a b'diavad. But what it might mean in that context is, given certain realities, then there might be an obligation to take, action and to initiate the divorce. That's what we saw last time, that the in the Chuvas Harajba and the Abu Dram, they suggest that, when the relationship in a marriage, due to the behavior or the conduct of the participants, is completely incompatible with the goals and ideals of the marriage, then there, according to many Rishonim, there's an obligation to get divorced. And we'll see, hopefully we'll get to the text today, but the Gemara Daf Tzadi Amud Beis in Gittin and Lamed Zayin Amud Beis in Yevamos both speak about mitzvah legaresh, when, there's toxic behavior, in the marriage. So of course, it's not the same as Kiddushin, where it's an across the board, all things being equal, across the board obligation. But it is parallel in the sense that when the conditions are appropriate, it's the same kind of a mitzvah. That's the second element. And the third one is the Rambam himself, which is what we're going to analyze a little more fully now. And that is that the mitzvah in both cases may very well be, the method.
Whatever the reasons you have that the Gemara's, which we'll get to, make the condition of a mitzvah lagaresh. Right. Could it also be somewhat like, it's not exactly a prenuptial, but an intranuptial, but with the mitzvah of kedushin, one is embracing the idea that should certain circumstances occur, without definition, it's like a tolda of an av. The av being, there's no divorce without a marriage. So obviously, if there's a mitzvah to get to be lakadesh, that's one thing, and then automatically, it falls from that perspective that if the conditions are such that it's a mitzvah to have grushin, then basically it's almost like a tolda. It's within the mitzvah, so to speak. It's subsumed by the mitzvah of kedushin.
Well, what I would say is, this we are going to discuss, and I think you're right. It does depend on what you think are proper grounds for, for taking.
No, yes, it's not just willy-nilly, but in those conditions.
Instead of seeing it, them as opposites, though, this is certainly something I'm going to push.
Nice.
And we find it actually in some early sources. The Sefer Abatim was a scholar of Provence, Rabbi David Kochavi. He wrote a work called Sefer Abatim, which, explores, a little more philosophically / halachically, all the mitzvos of the Taryag of the 613. And we'll soon, we'll see, if not today, then when we finish this next one, that he makes this suggestion as well, that, sometimes, the best way to accomplish sanctity, is to acknowledge, that, notwithstanding the optimism and the initial idealism and promise of a certain kind of relationship, if that's not to be, then sometimes, sanctity dictates, an exit strategy, which I think is what you're saying. So then it's not so much like, one kind of mitzvah and then the opposite, but it becomes like an internal matter, trying to, like, what's the best way to express, sanctity, in life. Sometimes it's, to initiate, and sometimes it's to, withdraw.
It could also just be a mechanism to break a partnership. Like sometimes people create a partnership
Right.
with a mechanism to buy the other one out, etc. So getting is just a mechanism to undo the kedushin in the most refined diplomatic way possible.
Correct. Well, that is certainly true on one level. And again, that's what we talked about in terms of the psukim, that, that twice the Torah uses the same exact words to describe a get, b'kasav la sefer krisos v'nasam biyada, v'shilcha mibeso. And I think the reason for that is exactly that, when sadly you have to dismantle this structure, this creation, which is more than the sum of its parts, meaning the marriage, then you have to do so in a way that is dignified and that, is rigorous and that, doesn't leave loose ends, or any kind of, residual improper control or ties, that would hold, each party back. So it's a very carefully constructed approach. And that's why I think it's so detailed. And that's why the Torah uses very specific language. And as we've discussed, when the Rambam opens Hilchos Gerushin, he actually doesn't emphasize the mitzvah, but what he does emphasize is the institution, even though he thinks it's a mitzvah. We'll get back to that in a second. And his emphasis is on the 10, what he calls the 10 requirements of a get, all of which pretty much issue from those words, because each word is loaded. Because of law, I mean, I think I went through very quickly. Because of, you need to get law, it has to be lishma, meaning it has to be with purity of motive. It has to be, can't go, can't get a generic, a factory ordered, get. It has to be personal. So it's v'kasav, it's law. It's got to be a sefer, sfiras dvarim, krisos, davra kores, beino levena, v'nasan, notli gitech malgabe karka. She has to give it to her. She picks it up on her own. She can't initiate her own divorce. She shouldn't be expected to. V'nasan, biyada, in her either hand or her possessions. V'shilcha, not v'sholcha, but v'shilcha. He emphatically, they part in an emphatic way. Mi beso, right? She shouldn't be mishulechet v'chozeret, it should be v'ena chozeret. And it ends their beso relationship. That's my part of the drasha. So I think, Jacob, that you're right. All these things and all these 10 components are a very dignified, refined, thorough way of addressing, what was a very formidable, serious structure. And in order to move away from that, to move on from that, you have to be careful. Welcome.
Hi.
I think we missed you a few times.
Yes, I was traveling.
Okay, well, welcome back. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
We'll see if you do that like disappearing thing that you've done in the past.
But Rabbi, that's also part of the
On the Zoom.
ksuba. Is that part of the ksuba? I mean, the financial arrangements are unique for each situation, but there are automatic requirements. Like that's the meaning. That's why we do the ksuba or
Right. No, so the ksuva, for example, again, we'll have to get back to our topic in a moment, but the ksuva is shalot tehei kala be'enav lehotzia.
so there should be some
The ksuva is
ramifications.
there in order to slow down any kind of, temperamental outburst, any kind
Impulse.
of, what?
Impulsive actions.
Yeah, exactly. To neutralize, being impulsive and, being, doing something precipitous just because of anger or some other, out of control, short-lived, emotion. But it's also, this is my view broadly, that especially if you hold that ksuva is daraisa, that it also provides, a certain sense of security for each party in the marriage. So people aren't, constantly, living, in some sort of terror, that it's going to end, and that people can feel, a sense of security so that they can voice their opinions and they can, negotiate their issues. And there's a certain sense of confidence in the marriage because it's not something that you walk away from easily. So in addition to being compensation,
Is it not?
what?
Mostly for the woman's benefit, because the
No,
Talmud,
it's for the mature
the
benefit.
woman was in danger all the time because she didn't have very many options living by herself.
Right, but frankly, what's for her benefit? This is true in life, by the way, about to make a big statement. Whenever you have, any kind of relationship of people, what's to the benefit of one party in terms of sense of
Security.
security and confidence is always beneficial, for the bond and for both parties. The mistake that we make is because we live in a very competitive society, in a very short-sighted society. People always look at who's in a stronger position, and everything is kind of evaluated in that way, and that is short-sighted, and it's really not the halachic approach at all. So if the woman is more confident and more secure, in the marriage, then obviously that's a healthier relationship, and one in which both can thrive and flourish. So it's a good investment, for everybody. So that's so you're right. All these institutions surrounding Jewish family life are really extraordinary institutions. They're crafted. Some of them are biblical law. They're midin Torah. They're divine fiat. Others are supplemented. So there's a debate about it by rabbinic, wisdom and rabbinic law. But each each component is just incredibly impressive, and it's all intended to create a certain holistic approach, and that's kind of what we've been discussing. Anyways, so on the three perspectives on is marriage and divorce an institution? Is it a obligation, imperative, or is it focused on the method, and that's the mitzvah? We certainly could distinguish between Gittin and Kiddushin. In other words, there's more reason to look at Kiddushin as a positive requirement, obviously, than Gerushin, because the only way we can look at that as a positive requirement is if the circumstances are exactly correct. Having said that, so we went through, what's that?
Even in light later on in the Masechta, the three-way discussion of Akiva and two other.
Yeah, that's what we're gonna be addressing that hopefully.
About what should be the
grounds of divorce.
Catalyst for divorce, and Rabbi Akiva seems to take a very
Well, both Beis Hillel and Rabbi Akiva take seemingly frivolous positions. But what we're going to try to show, and this is what
Well, it's
David.
really the contrary. What they're saying is that the kedusha and the sanctity of marriage is such that even the slightest impediment or distraction to that, it makes it an imperfect marriage, and therefore.
Well, I would say it a little bit different. I agree with and this is what David was bringing up before as well. And I was agreeing with him. I wouldn't say
By
it
the way, I think
exactly
we
that way.
discussed this like 8-10 years ago.
Yeah.
In the Masechta.
Right. So I think what I was saying then and what I'm going to say when we get back to it a little bit differently now is that not so much that any imperfection is not tolerated, but any imperfection that is magnified by the parties to be of such great significance that it's not tolerated reflects and reveals a very deeply flawed, relationship. If somebody, if overcooking the stew, or people's, aesthetic, eye wanders, matza isha na hemena, so to such an extent that
That's
becomes a
symptomatic.
motive for them to end the marriage.
A bigger problem.
Exactly. Then what it reflects is that sanctity has left this marriage, a while ago, and therefore it's not the frivolity of the actual, factor itself. It's the reflection, that this is not a refined and a dignified and a secure
Relationship.
and a respectful mutual, bond anymore. But that we're going to get back to all that.
Rabbi
For
Rosensweig,
now, yeah.
I'd like
Yeah.
to just add one thought, which has been
Sure.
troubling me most of the week since we spoke about Gerushin as perhaps a kind of a mitzvah last week. And lingering with that thought all week, it does seem to me that there is a flaw in the argument, or at least something which is unclear. And what you're saying now only increases my own sort of personal sense that it's very hard to bring it to the same level as Kiddushin, and how it was gotten to that same level where there is something to equate between Gerushin and Kiddushin.
Right. I don't
Something which
need
is
to equate them
a
at all.
mystery to me, at least.
Yeah, no, I'm not equating them. I'm speaking about them being that. I'm glad you brought it up. But there's a difference between equating and suggesting that there's a parallel. And that's what I'm suggesting is the parallel, not the equation. Meaning, Kiddushin is always an ideal, and it's always something, which, as an institution at least, is aspirational. And of course, divorce is always tragic, and is never aspirational.
Yes.
It reflects a failure. Again, not a failure necessarily in terms of blame. There are all sorts of, in the real world, there are all sorts of factors. And nobody doesn't mean blame this. Sometimes there's blame and sometimes there's not. And sometimes it's, just people, becoming distant from one another. So what I'm really trying to say is the opposite. What I'm trying to say is you can't compare Kiddushin and Gerushin in terms of the equating, how constructive, they are, because there's no comparison whatsoever. What I am examining is whether or not the concept of a mitzvah is parallel, meaning what we say in Kiddushin is like, it's always a mitzvah to get married. Is it ever a mitzvah to get divorced? Let's say in a situation where there's a very toxic, environment, or one party, has already betrayed, the marriage vows. So of course it's not the same, what we call a kum va'aseh, but what it is it's parallel. Just as here there's an obligation to take action, to take initiative, so too there's an obligation to take action initiative. In the case of Kiddushin, you're taking action initiative because objectively, this is a better spiritual, state to be in. And in the case of Gerus, it's all relativistic. It's given the sad reality, of a failed, promising, life. Right now, this is the best option available to you. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, or you'll tell me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go on with the discussion too much this evening, but I don't think it really answers it completely. And the position, I mean, lahavdil,
Yeah.
let's say the Roman Catholic position of divorce is not an option under any circumstances.
Right.
While we tend to downgrade and denigrate that particular point of view, there may be something deeper there that is related to what we're talking about here.
Oh, yeah, we're going to get to that.
But isn't the issue here that they are?
We actually will get to that. Actually, we're going to get to it in a minute for non-Jews.
There is a
and we're going to get back
parallelism.
to it, say, for chinuch for Jews as well. Yeah.
Isn't there a parallelism here? And in fact, that's what makes it so much greater than the other religions. And the fact is that both the Gerushin and the Kedushin have one aim: to create a certain relationship of Kedushin sanctity that has to exist in a relationship, and to continue a relationship that doesn't reach that level.
Right. That's the
And so
that's
both
what
are
we mean when
trying to
we're talking-
accomplish the same thing, really, from a different.
right, but that doesn't mean they're
One-
equated
one-
because they
one
come.
is trying to create it from the beginning in a hopeful, approach, and the other is saying that in order to maintain that goal, we can't continue as the situation is right now. It
Right. If
defies
you were
the
to-
goal. It defies the definition of Jewish marriage.
And as if you were to take a Catholic approach and say that there is no exit, strategy, even for a very toxic
Then it
marriage,
denigrates the quality of marriage.
right, that would affect the quality of marriage. I mean, you can admire that from the perspective of,
Aspirational.
shooting any kind of frivolity, triviality, in the sense of that, encouraging people, to make every effort, to put, their relationships, back, on solid footing. I mean, there's a lot to admire about discouragement. We'll see. Basically, you're making the loop.
But not giving an option means if you end a marriage, according to them, you've failed. The Jewish world, you can get remarried and move on. Meaning, the Torah gave us people a way to do it in the right way. So
correct. So what I'm saying is, what you don't want. This is really. I mean, we're going to get to this, but this is Beis Shammai Beis Hillel Rabbi Akiva. Beis Shammai basically said in the last Mishnah in Gittin, that unless there's a betrayal of the marriage vows, it's improper to get divorced. Matzah erbas davar. So they're not taking the view that there's no circumstances in which you can exit a marriage, but they are making it very, very. They're setting a very high standard, a very high bar for circumstances that justify leaving this institution. The goal being, like anything less than that, you should respect the marriage, or you should work on the marriage, etc. The bigger question, which we were alluding to before, is what about the position of Rabbi Akiva and the position of Hillel? Rabbi Akiva said, "Matzah isha na'imena," and he wasn't saying that's a good thing. He knew it wasn't a good thing either. He was saying, well, if he's unhappy, and he wants to marry, he's found a better partner, then he can do that. He can end the marriage. That doesn't mean we're encouraging him. We might even be discouraging or disappointed in him, but that's an option that he has, rather than, to use the language of the Malbim. We'll talk about other formulations later. The Malbim says something which we're all familiar with, and it's a great insight. The Malbim says, listen, if we were to take, I'm paraphrasing, the Catholic view of denying, divorce, then, not only, could you end up in situations that are very toxic, and very unhappy, and that also end up being undermining, what the institution is supposed to be all about. But in addition to that, you might psychologically be dooming, relationships that otherwise could actually, be put right again. Because when people feel that they have no options, their sense of frustration and disappointment, has a life and has impact, of its own. Mom says, if I tell you that we all just finished a pandemic a couple of years ago. If I tell you, you're quarantined and you have to stay home, right? So all you want to do is leave. I'm not saying you're going to do it, but If I tell you you are not allowed to leave your room, right? So the sense of being imprisoned is palpable, right? But if I tell you, you have a vacation from work and, you might want to stay home. So that's the example that the Malbim, let me find it actually. I think I have the language, meaning that's the psychology, that is also part of these issues. I think I have it. This is the Malbim. Listen to this. And that's not what we were talking about before about, whether or not, seemingly frivolous grounds for divorce doesn't reflect an already very flawed situation. That's a separate point. But listen to the Malbim, the inside of the Malbim. Ulahazbir hadavar, you don't have it in your Marmakovos, but I have it. Ulahazbir hadavar, to explain, he says, Mashi yitachen shebenot Yisrael yu kalos ha'erach. He's asking the question. It seems like, according to Hillel and according to Rabbi Akiva, that we're playing fast and loose and we're being frivolous about allowing people to divorce for reasons, that don't seem very justified. Asher mira acheres na himena o shekdicha tavshilo shetatir atorah legarsha, because he doesn't like she did this or she did that, she angered him, or he has a wandering gaze, that's an excuse for divorce. We understand the question, right? But listen to what he answers. Aval mishpatei Hashem emes. The laws of God are true. That's true. Right? It's reverse psychology, in a way. The Rebbeinu Shalom wanted people to, to maintain their marriages, if possible. Chaye ratzon, but to do so, not because they feel trapped, but out of a sense of joy and as an act of volition. V'lo chaye hechreach, not because they have no choice. You box somebody into a corner, he feels trapped, and then he can't even assess accurately the pros and cons of his situation. V'im lo yecholos biyado legarsha, says the Malbim, if there was no capacity to divorce, everybody would sink into, like a despondency and say, I have a terrible situation, but there's nothing I can do about it. Any little thing, he'll magnify and exaggerate in his mind, to be, I'm in prison. Lo yecholes legarsha, when he has an exit strategy, then he has a real choice. When he has a real choice, he's thinking more clearly, and he appreciates, that when you make a choice, there's an upside and a downside. As long as you can't make a choice, you tend to exaggerate everything that is negative. And when you have an option, then you have to realistically live with your choice. Then the positives are also very powerful. B'chashvo, he has to think, Shem Yisa Acheres Gam Hi Lo Tia Tova Imena. Nobody's perfect. The Kozman Shelo Girsha, right? Behechreach Uchaye Ratzon. And when a person knows that he has options and he chooses, to work on and to try to rectify a relationship, then that's Chaye Ratzon. So you have exactly the same circumstance, but the psychology of feeling like you have no options, right, actually deepens your suffering and dooms the possibility of salvaging the situation. B'nazbir adavar b'mashal katan, says the Malbim. Let's take a little mashal. Im ichartzu leish sheyeshev b'bayis yom echad la'onesh yechashev lo. If the judge says, I hereby impose
house arrest,
a sentence, you can't leave your home. What do they call it? House arrest? Is that
house
it?
arrest.
Okay. So house arrest, for one day, right? He's suffering with that, right? Umiritzono yeshev kalu bebeso kamayanim v'techashev lo od laoneg olanachas. But if he has vacation, many times he'll just choose, I can just stay home. enjoy the comfort of his home. But if he's on house arrest, then he feels like he's in prison. So the fine line between feeling imprisoned and feeling, the joy of and the appreciation of what you have is something which is immeasurably enhanced, says the Malbim, by choice. So even if we're disappointed in some of the grounds, that could end up, being, employed or invoked, to end a marriage, the alternative, which is the sense of being entrapped, ends up, encouraging all the worst impulses, and deepens the sense of suffering, and ends up having a counterproductive. It's a brilliant comment by the Malbim, frankly. That's different than what I was saying before, but I think they're both true. There's no, they're not mutually exclusive. On the one hand is this idea that we just discussed, the benefit of choice, doing something, making a clear-headed decision in which, the pros, are also, clear, not just the cons. That's one. And number two is, this idea that, often, temperamental, not always, but sometimes, frivolous behavior, temperamental behavior, sometimes that's all that it is, and you just want to stop it. But in other cases, when it persists, it betokens like a deeper flaw. And that deeper flaw, may be a certain toxic factor that really does need to be neutralized. So it's a complicated issue. Getting back to the Rambam just for a minute so we can finish this part of it. The Rambam's view about the mitzvah of Gerushin and the mitzvah of Kiddushin is that they are parallel, again, not equal, Chalila. Parallel in the sense that they're same, the category, the type of mitzvah that they are is the same. And what is that type? So as we've discussed, for the Rambam, there's no mitzvah to get married. There's a mitzvah when you get married in the halachically prescribed way, namely to get married with Kiddushin prior to Nisu. Jewish marriage is broken up into two components. One is the formal kinyan, contractual part, that's the erusin or the Kiddushin. The second part is the chuppah or the Nisuin. And what the Rambam says in the beginning of Hilchos Ishus and in Sefer Mitzvos and so on is that the, doing this according to proper protocol is the mitzvah. Not getting married, but getting married, by
elevating the process to something sanctity.
Oh, so that's my take on
why
it.
the bracha is so long.
The method is a way of elevating. That's what I want to show just for briefly. So the Ram says the same thing about Gerushin. If you look in the Marmakomos here, now we're back in the Marmakomos. If you look on page 2, Sefer Mitzvahs l'Rambam, Mitzvah say Reish Kapes, HaMitzvah Reish Kapes, Shetzivanu l'garish bishtar, al kolpanim kishanirtza l'garish. When you want to get divorced, do it with a contract. Oh. So why does that elevate the Gerushin?
It makes it more serious. It makes it
Exactly.
less frivolous.
Number one, it slows it down. Number two, it makes it more serious. If you can't just verbally walk away, but you are obligated to, and not only that, it's a personal document. It's law, lishma. It's unequivocal. It cuts the ties and leaves no residual, manipulative, strings attached, and so on and so forth. All of that, which is part of the nature of this contract, the methodology is the mitzvah. So I just want to show you also, just to highlight this in two ways. First of all, this is exactly what the Sefer Chinuch says. If you look on page 2, Sefer Chinuch Mitzvah Tav Kuf Ayin Tes, Mitzvah la rotza lagarish asishto sheyigarsheno bishtar, says the Chinuch. It's a mitzvah on whoever wants to get divorced to do so with a star, and then he's clearer. Right? When you want to get divorced, we're obligated ligaresh osan biksav, to do it b'derech ksav. So now I'd like to show, I think, why do I say that this method or these methods elevate the process in terms of kedusha? So look at the Inamar Makomos. Look on page 5. This is a Yerushalmi and Masechet Kedushin Perek Aleph. Everybody have page 5? Yeah? Hopefully? Okay. So the Yerushalmi says the following. Remember that B'nai Noach, non-Jews, also are obligated to have faithful marriages.
They're
Right?
also obligated to have what?
Say again?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch you. They're obligated to what?
To have faithful marriages.
Which one of the Shiva Mrs. B'nai Noach
So
says
that,
that?
that's the Davak Be'ishto.
Dinam? That being Dinam? What?
No. Some people say it's Gezel, some people say it's independent. But the Yerushalmi in Kiddushin discusses what are the differences between Jewish and non-Jewish marriage and divorce. So the Yerushalmi says the following. Hari lamadnu, we learned, Goyim ein lahem Kiddushin. That doesn't mean what it seems like. It doesn't mean they don't have marriage. It means they don't have Kiddushin, they only have Nesuah. They only, meaning the way that a marriage between two non-Jews is formalized is not through a kinyan, but through the agreement that they will, that they will wed and that they will live together. The Maisabiyah, put it this way.
Didn't the Rambam explain in his introduction that before Matan Torah and Kedushin?
Exactly. That when the Rambam explains that, that's exactly what Rambam says.
That there was
Matan Torah.
not Kedushin, not Nesuah, nothing.
Koda Matan Torah hare Adam Pogea Isha Bishuk. They would meet. Ratzahu Ratztahi, if they both agreed, then he would bring her home. Literally.
So maybe that's the Nesuah.
It would be Machnisa Osa Lebeso, and they would live and they would marry. They would live a wedded life.
That's the chuppah aspect, basically.
Yeah, that's kind of chuppah. So if you look, that's what it means. Hari lamadnu goyim ein lem kiddushin means they have no erusin. Okay, but look at the next line. What about their gerushin? Mahu sheyeh lahem gerushin, says Yerushalmi. Do they have gerushin? So the Gemara, the Yerushalmi says, Rabbi Yudah ben Pazi Rab Chanin bar b'shem Rab Chuna Rabba Ditziporin said, O she'ein lahem gerushin, O sheshnei megarshin zeh. Two possibilities. Now, the first option is ein lahem gerushin. What does that mean, ein lahem gerushin? So there are two explanations of this first option. The Chidushei Aran in Sanhedrin says that what it means is the Catholic position. Ein lahem gerushin. Jewish law says that non-Jews don't have divorce.
So they're stuck according to these Yerushalmi.
According to this Yerushalmi, according to the Ran's reading. As we'll see in a moment, not true for the Rambam. The Rambam understood what it meant was there's no get, meaning there's no contract. The gittin, it's the exact opposite. Not that there's no exit strategy. There's an easier exit strategy. A verbal or a symbolic, withdrawal from the marriage is enough for a get. That's, we'll see in a moment. That's how the Rambam interprets.
Is there any hindrance to party B taking any woman who is married to somebody else?
No, you're not allowed to do that. That's a death penalty, Ben Noach violation.
That's not the Shiva Mitzvahs Ben Noach, no?
Yeah, meaning this is very serious. This is a faithful marriage.
So how then?
You're trying to figure out what is the
How
marriage.
how then can he observe that mitzvah if he doesn't know who's married and who's divorced?
No, they know. People know. Why wouldn't they know? Maybe it's registered.
I mean, there's a call, like a civil marriage.
Yeah, exactly.
How do we? I thought
I'm sorry.
I thought in Yahadut we had to have a written get. I didn't think of verbal.
You do in Judaism for Jews, to dissolve a
Ah.
Jewish marriage. This is exactly what I'm trying to contrast.
Okay.
I'm going to try. What the Yerushalmi is saying is, what's the difference between Jewish law's approach to non-Jewish marriage and Jewish law's approach to Jewish marriage? And divorce. So when it comes to marriage, the difference is Jewish law for Jews requires erusin and nisuin. You with me? Jewish law for
Yes.
non-Jews for marriage only requires what we call nisuin. What about divorce? Jewish law for Jews requires
Creases.
a get, meaning a written, very specific, that's what we've been talking about, very specific bill of divorce. And not only that, it has to come from the husband, because he's the one who initiates the Kiddushin, and therefore he has to initiate the Gerushin. Non-Jewish law, non-Jewish marriages, according to Jewish law, there are two views in the Yerushalmi. One is,
There is no
there's no such thing, or it can be done even more even without a document, even without a contract. It can be done just by the agreement to withdraw. And we'll see this. What's the second day of the Yerushalmi? Or either one can divorce the other.
But also verbally.
Also verbally. So then, it's
So
really
so
fascinating.
you want to say that the church fathers, as they call themselves, were following this Yerushalmi, the first,
If they held like the Chiddush Ran.
I mean,
So look at the Rambam now. Rambam Hilchos Malachim Parak Test, the next entry. Everybody have it?
Ein ben Noach.
Ein ben Noach chayiv al eshes chavero. We're talking about the, one non-Jew. You have a non-Jewish marriage, and another non-Jew violates that marriage, meaning he, and the wife and some other man are unfaithful to the marriage, right? That triggers a death penalty. However, what does marriage mean for Ben Noach, based on the Yerushalmi? Not technical kinyan erusin, but they're actually living together. Okay? Now turn to halacha ches. That's where the Rambam speaks about non-Jewish divorce. Go to line number 2, the last word on line number 2. When will a marriage between two non-Jews be terminated? And then the woman will be considered divorced, and therefore she can remarry, someone else, the non-Jews, in other words. Says the Rambam, when he sends her away, right? Or she goes away. Meaning, like the view that says that
Either one can do it.
Either one can do it. Doesn't have to be the husband. And then he explains she'ein lahem gerushin b'ksav, because you don't need a bill of divorce, you don't need a contract. It can be verbal. The ein hadavar toli bo levad, and it also doesn't. It's not unilateral, or it doesn't depend more on him. It doesn't have to be initiated by him. Ela kozman sheyirtzehu ohi lifrosh zemizeh portion. As long as either one of them agrees to end their bond, that does it. And from then on, there's no violation of the marriage and there's no death penalty for Ben Noach. A lot is at stake here. So the Rambam was asked the following, the Nosei Kalim and the Rambam asked the following question. The Yerushalmi has two views, right? Either you don't need a
diametrically opposite views.
Or, well, no, if you hold like the Chiddush Ran, that means that they can't get divorced at all.
Yeah.
But the Rambam probably didn't read it that way. So how come the Rambam says both views? Number one, either one can initiate the divorce. And number two, you don't need a contract.
They're not contradictory.
They're not. But how does he know that both?
Why can't
The
he
answer is as follows. The answer is very simple. Now look back at the Rambam's view of what the mitzvah Lagarish is and the mitzvah Lakadesh. What's the mitzvah Lakadesh? The method. having Kiddushin prior to Nisuin. Meaning, don't marry like the non-Jews marry, as important. We're not ridiculing non-Jewish marriage. It's a category in Jewish law. Jews recognize non-Jewish marriages. But we're saying is that for Jews who live a life of Torah and mitzvos and greater sanctity, etc., we have a higher standard. You can't just, plunge into the marriage, right? You have to first secure everybody's rights. There has to be a kinyan, there has to be erusin, only then can there be Nisuin. That's what the bracha means. We hit to the V'tzivanu al arayos, v'asar lanu es arusos, meaning not right away. Then v'hitzer lanu es anusuos lanu aydei chuppah v'kiddush. The bracha, I've said this many times, but for the Rambam, the Rosh says that
the question why chuppah comes before Kiddushin, that's another story.
Okay, because that's the goal, and that's the goal, and that's the method. So, the Rosh says he doesn't understand if it's a mitzvah and it's a birchas mitzvah. Why is the bracha so long and so intricate and so complicated?
According to the Rambam, makes perfect sense.
What?
According to the Rambam, makes perfect sense why the bracha is like that.
Exactly, because for the Rambam, the mitzvah is the method, and the mitzvah, the bracha, is telling you why the method is so important. The method is an investment in upgrading the spirituality of the marriage. But the same is true for the divorce. That's what I want to say. Meaning, what we're saying is non-Jewish divorce is, again, no one's ridiculing it, Khalila. We're saying non-Jewish marriage is more pragmatic. They're living together as husband and wife. And non-Jewish divorce is more pragmatic. Namely, one of the parties, even if it's only verbal, agrees that it's over. No one can impose on the other. And it's not the kind of bond that's so difficult to unravel, right? It was put together by mutual consent, as a physical, intimate living arrangement. And when that intimate physical living arrangement by one party, is no longer satisfactory, so the marriage is over. Until that point, there's something called betrayal, and that's, a violation of mitzvahs b'nei Noach. But after that point, it's fine. So when the Rambam wants to describe what is unique and what is sanctified about Jewish divorce, what does he say? It's the method. It's the fact. It's the 10 dvarim, which means that the get has to come from the husband, and it has to be a document. And it has to be a document so that to slow things down, to formalize them, to make reference, because you're not just undoing or walking away from an ishus. The building ishus was formidable and required a great deal of commitment, right? So to neutralize it, and to override it, it requires more than a verbal agreement. If he's one to initiate it, then he has to end it. That is the way it is. So this Yerushalmi and the Rambams and Hilchos Malachim provide invaluable perspective on what is unique about Jewish divorce, what is unique about Jewish marriage, and why the Rambam chose to formulate, the mitzvah in these terms.
The Rambam doesn't feel that the creation of the get, because I think the Gemara talks about it at some point, that the whole process, the expense, the time is also meant to slow down the potential impulse for divorce.
He doesn't say it. The Sefer Chinuch says it. The Sefer Chinuch says that. Okay. So in light of that, or, against all of this background, we should now take a look at the last Mishnah in Gittin that we were talking about, because that just, flows basically from what we've discussed. So if anybody has, I'll try to maybe make copies for next time, but I assume everybody has access to a Gemara.
Which Mishnah are you talking about, Rabbi?
What's that?
Which Mishnah are you talking about?
Tzadi Amud Aleph.
Which one?
Tzadi 90a.
Oh, Tzadi, so I have to take another.
You don't have to,
That's the
you don't have to
problem with us.
read it all till you
Why-
get there.
That's why you
Rabbi,
need an old, you need an
Rabbi,
old-fashioned Gemara.
Rabbi, since I have your attention for a minute,
You
if I
always have my
may,
attention.
I'm sorry. First of all, I'm sorry I missed last week. I was away. It seems to me from what we are learning that the focus here is number one, Matzaba Ervas Dover. And
Right.
that gives him the proper reason why he has to initiate.
Well, we'll discuss
And
it. That's what we're about to discuss.
Yeah, I
Shammai
understand.
ben Hillel and Rabbi Kiva.
Yeah. The problem that I look at is I'm not an advocate of anything, but it bothers me that the man is matzaba erva. It doesn't say that the woman found an erva that her husband dealt with another woman, and therefore she would like to initiate a divorce, and she really has no power because the psukim in the Chumash tell us that it is up to the husband to give that. The wife cannot give a divorce. That
Correct.
is an issue that we hear today in modern times very much from women and good women and kosher women, whatever,
Right.
that it's all the husband, and they really don't have any right. Yes, he has to provide her with everything because the Ksuba said it, we understand it. But
Well,
basically, we have an issue that the husband is the boss, so to speak, and the wife has no say, because if he wants to marry her, to divorce her, then he divorces her. She cannot divorce him.
it is very challenging to understand that, but we're not here, to challenge, the biblical law. So, but to understand it, I think the reason that, likely the reason that it's his initiative and that he can, again, there is something called Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom. That's,
oh yes, of course.
that was meant to augment the biblical law in order to create practical, greater, not complete, but greater parity between the spouses. So the Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom says that he's not allowed to divorce her against her will. And there are other mechanisms which, Kofanoso Yoma Rotsani, which we discussed at the end of last year, which also compensate, etc. So on a practical level, historically, Chachmei HaMatzorah, did build in certain mechanisms, to, I guess, compensate for what seems to be a very unilateral approach. But, having said that, the fact remains that whether we understand it fully or not, biblical law, which is divine law, does say that this comes from the husband. I've been portraying it, and I believe it to be the case, that the reason that he is the one who has to initiate the divorce, and once he can initiate even, against her will, is because he's the one who created the Ishus, right? And therefore, again, in that relationship, it's what I call spiritual specialization.
Although there's a flaw in that a little bit, in the fact that when he created it, he needed her consent, and when he breaks it up,
well, I think the reason for that is what we discussed. Right, that's a great point, but that doesn't trouble me at all. This is what we discussed at the very end of last year, and that is, of course, when he creates it, he needs her consent because they have no relationship, and of course, you can't impose your will on somebody you have no relationship with. But in the context of an existing, a bond, where people have different functions in that bond, then the possibility of a more, this one has a more forceful and the other one has, a different role, etc., that becomes more possible. So that I understand. Again, we're reconstructing, the divine fiat. So whether we understand fully why it wasn't different, that's one question. I think it's legitimate to ask. But we're here as students of the law, trying to understand,
yes, of course,
as best as possible, as sophisticated. We accept it, and we can have many questions. But either way, we need to understand it as best we can. And, there's still, even with all the questions, there's a lot, the system, mostly works. And in situations, regarding individuals, there will always be individual cases where there are abuses. That's just in the nature of all law. But mostly these are magnificent institutions, and we have some questions, about some of the particulars, which are very fair questions, frankly. Okay.
So again, the Mishnah, I want to get it from my Aron
The Mishnah is
Sfarim.
90a, Tzadi Amud Aleph.
Okay, I'll get it. The Gemara.
Since we're not, when we were in the synagogue, we had a
It's
volume.
the last Mishnah.
What's that?
Okay.
It's the last Mishnah. Right?
Yeah. So I see, Mrs. Oppenheim is with us on the Zoom, and her husband was very kind. Always used to bring provide us with the Gemaras
Right,
that
correct.
we would give out, and he was very modest. I don't know if she's still on Zoom, but he was always very modest, and he'd say no. But he was very nice about it, and we always had Gemaras. So I sometimes assume everybody has them at home. So I hope I'm assuming correctly in many cases. Some people have it on the computer, right? So in many cases, I'm assuming correct, but I'll try to copy the text for next time, either way, and send it to the office, since we're going to be on this for next week, and then we're going to skip back to the beginning of the Masechta. But this is obviously a very critical topic. You mentioned before that we had discussed it when we were getting some years ago as well, but it's a linchpin in defining the Jewish perspective on get. Okay, so the Mishnah on Tzadi Amud Aleph, everybody who has access has it. What's that?
I have it. Yeah, I have the Gemara. Yeah.
So just let's before we break in a minute, let's just get through the Mishnah and the first Gemara. Mishnah says, Beis Shammai Omrim, by Shammai with the opinion, Lo Yigaresh Adam es Ishto Elam Kein Matzaba Dvar Erva. The person cannot.
But that's consistent with the pasuk, of course.
Yeah, Umatzaba Ervas Davar. So Ervas Davar or Dvar Erva means that she violated the marriage contract, meaning she was unfaithful to the marriage. That's a simple reading. Whether it means more than that or more cases than that, we'll discuss next week when we move forward and hopefully complete most of this. But that is the Matzah Ervas Davar is, so the grounds of, we'll analyze in a minute. So that's what Beis Shammai say. That divorce requires a violation of the marriage contract.
Is Beis Shammai following the halacha and saying not only that he can divorce her, but he must divorce her? Because
Correct.
really the law is he must divorce her if there's really an Ervas Davar, no?
Well, I mean, technically what the Mishnah is saying is that these are the only conditions that justify a divorce. It doesn't say that he has to divorce her. There is a little bit of a flexible area here, and there's a debate about it. Clearly, he should divorce her, but what's prohibited is if she was unfaithful in the marriage, they can't live together anymore.
But in theory, they could be married and not live together, but that's also a problem.
Yeah, correct. But I'm talking about on a biblical level, the Isur of Sota is that they shouldn't have a physical relationship. Whether or not there must be a divorce, obviously it's
a practical solution.
But if you want to know technically, the Mishnah really is speaking about justifying grounds for divorce and saying the only justified grounds are an objective breakdown of the marriage. Okay. Shenemar ki matzah ba'ervas davar. Beis Hillel omrim. Beis Hillel say this is such a contrast. Afilu ikticha tavshilo. Even if she overcooks the meat.
Although this is meant intentionally overcooked, no?
Yeah. So that the Meiri says that.
Yeah.
The Meiri says she's trying to annoy him.
Yeah, I mean,
they have such an antagonistic relationship, that she, misses no opportunity to
make his life miserable.
That, of course, is very different. Right? That's different than, she.
But that's still lower than Ervas Davar.
What?
That's still a level.
Yeah, right, correct. But it's closer to. It's somewhere in the middle. Right?
Rashi says that even if you just put some salt there.
Shenemar ki matzah ba'ervos davar. Rabbi Akiva says afilu matzah acheres no hemena. Shenemar v'hoyim motim tachein beina. So there is a debate about all three views about what it means. With regard to Beis Shammai, the debate is, let me say it this way first. If you just take the words of the Mishnah, kipshutam, just simply, it sounds like we have two radical views. We have Beis Shammai who basically says you should not, or you cannot break up a marriage unless the most severe infraction and violation has taken place. Otherwise, the appropriate thing is to fight for that marriage. Is he also saying that that the divorce, will not be effective, or is he telling you, prescriptively that it's not proper? Not clear in Beis Shammai. But either way, Beis Shammai's simple emphasis is on the objective toxicity, or the a marriage that is unsalvageable, basically. An marriage that is not salvageable should lead to divorce. Anything else, probably not. And the simple reading of Beis Hillel and Rabbi Akiva in the opposite direction is that, even trivial, frivolous, grounds, she didn't do anything wrong in a marriage, and nothing that, some cooking lessons wouldn't cure. Or Nebuch, he, all of a sudden somebody else catches his eye, literally, and that's a reason for divorce. So, however, so it sounds like we're dealing with two, views that are one opposite direction and the other in the completely, kivun hafuch, in the opposite.
Isn't the common denominator, they're all defining what is the line that at which you pass that the marriage is irretrievable?
I'm saying, well, I mean, if you interpret Knicha Tivshilo and Matzah Isha Na Hemena, kipshuta, without adding the things that we've added, before, then there's nothing irretrievable about it. It's just a whim, essentially. And it's a casual, frivolous, trivial whim at that. Right. So there are those who interpret the Mishnah in this way. For example, we'll see next week that Sefer Chinuch, in his first interpretation, understood that Beis Hillel and Rabbi Akiva mean what they say. Or, this is what they mean.
No,
and then, it might not be good. The Gemara is critical of this, but it works.
He has the right to.
However, there are two caveats that I want to stop with. One is what we said before. You mentioned there is another interpretation of Ikdicha Tavshilo, and that is that this reflects a certain intentional antagonism, meaning the personal. No one has betrayed the marriage vows necessarily, but the relationship between husband and wife, is completely soured. It's antagonistic. It's a nasty. It's been reduced to a very toxic, nasty, situation. Now, obviously,
if it happened only one, already has grounds for divorce, or is it a regular?
Again, everybody, no. I mean, again, if Ikdicha Tavshilo means the trivial, frivolous thing, then we're upset with him and we don't want it, and we're just saying that if he insists on going ahead, he can do it. We're saying basically you don't need grounds for divorce. If we mean by Ikdicha Tavshilo like the Meiri, let's let me read the line of the Meiri. Then we're not talking about something that is so frivolous anymore. We're basically talking about the breakdown of the relationship. Where did I put my? Hold on one second. We're talking about the breakdown of the relationship between the two of them. Right. We're talking about the fact that she does things to antagonize, and to hurt him. Here it is. If you look at the Me'iris on page, and we're going to stop in one more minute. Excuse me. The Me'iri is on page
4.
Page 5. Beis Habechira leMe'iri Pesachet Gittin Pei Tes Samud Beis.
Okay.
No, Daf Sadik Amud Aleph.
Pei Tes Samud Beis. There are two different Me'iris. Yeah. on page 5 in the Marmakomos. It starts off Amar Haram, that's the Rambam, Beishama Yitlu B'mila Erva. Go to the second paragraph. Amar Meiri, Beishama Omer Lo Yigarish Adam Esishto Lechatchila. Even Beishama, agree that if you insist on divorcing, it'll work, but it shouldn't be done. Elam kin matzah ba'ervas davar. So Omer davar zima, meaning unfaithful. But this is what he said. That's not his chiddush. It's Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel afilu kdicha tavshilo. Rotzelomar. What does that mean? She'ena mishtadeles betzarchei beiso lahoshivam alafaneim. Va'inyan derech klal shemesareves lo ve'ena mitnaheges al pi ritzono. Meaning they have an antagonistic relationship. There are even some who suggest that Rabbi Akiva says, matzah isha na hemena. So usually we translate this in a physical way. And that's, obviously a very offensive thing to say that, that physical beauty alone, would be, or physical appearance alone would be a reason for divorce. But some of the Mefarshim point out that the phrase Noah Hemena or Ish Na'ah or Isha Na'ah often refers to Midos Tovos, meaning, let's say, somebody isn't in violation of, the worst, betrayal of a
That's
marriage.
also a breakdown in the marriage, that he doesn't appreciate what he has, so he thinks something else is better.
It's like a deeply, like a deep character flaw, basically. All right. So this is what we want to discuss next week. Is Beis Shammai so rigorous, or is Beis Shammai more expansive? And is Beis Hillel and Rabbi Akiva so frivolous, right? Or are they a little more...
It sounds that Beis Hillel is far stricter than Beis Shammai here.
No, how? Beis Shammai says...
Beis Shammai says, לא יגרש אדם אלא אם כן מצא בה דבר ערווה, period. Beis Hillel says, אפילו הקדיחה תבשילו ומצא בה ערווה.
Meaning Beis Hillel allows divorce with very little excuse.
That's what you mean.
Beis Shammai allows divorce only if there's a totally understandable excuse.
Exactly, that's what I mean. That therefore,
we're saying the same thing. You're just coming from opposite.
Yeah.
So this is what we want to discuss next week, and we want to get back to the idea that maybe everybody agrees that it's improper to divorce for frivolous, trivial reasons. The question is more like a psychological assessment as to, like, what level of sanctity makes a marriage appropriate. There's something called a grushas halev, which we'll discuss next week. Like a person who, is planning to get divorced. And once he's planning to get divorced, but he hasn't yet gotten divorced,
that raises
already
halachic problems.
It's almost like, cynical exploitation for them to continue, to live as husband and wife.
Yeah, but in all due respect, planning to get divorced, a lot of people maybe plan and they don't get divorced.
No, I'm not talking about.
They reconcile. What does
Right.
that mean? Until you do it, means nothing.
Right. No. So I'm not.
What does
talking
planning
about,
mean? What does that mean, really?
I'm not talking about like a fleeting consideration. What the Gemara
talking about
calls
separation. How do you define planning? Separation.
What the Gemara means about grushas halev is that the person has come definitively to the conclusion. He's just hasn't
put into effect. Yeah.
Implemented the process.
They have divorce lawyers. I mean, how do you define that? How does the Torah define that?
It means that he's totally, he's not, there's no doubt.
They checked out.
He's made, the quiet commitment, if not, publicized it, that, this is what's going to happen. So the Gemara considers it to be very despicable for, him to continue to mislead her or to continue to live with her, once he's come to that determination, because, based on things that we've been discussing, obviously the sanctity of the marriage at that point, is gone, right? So that I want to discuss these issues, try to finish it off if we can for next week, and then we'll move on to the beginning part of the Masechta. Okay?
Okay, looking forward. Thank you so much,
Yes.
Rabbi.
Thank you so much, yes.
Have a
Okay.
good night. Good night, Henry.
Have a good week, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Yes, of course, of course.
yes.